the work doesn't end just at finishing a study. And you'd accomplish a lot more if you took the time to try to translate your research findings into a form that might lead to its being taken up.
Welcome to VoxDevTalks. My name is Tim Phillips. How can evidence influence the decisions of policymakers, and whose advice are they most likely to take? Well, there's now more rigorous data about which interventions are working. That data doesn't translate into better policy unless a policymaker acts on it. So what type of information is going to lead them to update their beliefs, and which type of person delivering that information gets their ear? Eva Vivalt of the University of Toronto has studied this topic extensively, and she joins me now. Eva, welcome to VoxDevTalks.
Thank you very much.
Eva, this involves the evidence to policy pipeline, isn't it? That process of turning good evidence into government policy. In this process, there is a role for researchers and practitioners and policymakers. What are those roles?
It's not necessarily the case that you can very distinctly divide people into different roles. However, by and large, you can think of researchers as providing the evidence, and with practitioners and policymakers being in charge of implementing projects or advising others to implement projects, hopefully based on that evidence.
We've got some amazing research now. We cover it every week on VoxDevTalks. It's much more rigorous, the impact evaluations that we're getting now. What sort of information does a policymaker have access to now that perhaps wasn't available 20 years ago?
So rigorous evidence from RCTs is much more available. Mm-hmm. In fact, you can often find a study that will support any particular view. You can find some studies that will show a particular intervention has positive effects and some that show it has negative effects, maybe some that show precisely no effects. Mm-hmm. This means really that how people are selecting from that evidence becomes more important.
Right. And again, in a perfect world, we might assume that policymaker would update what they believe appropriately when they hear the new information, and inevitably when they update their beliefs, that leads to better policy. We're probably not in a perfect world, are we? Why might that not happen? Why might they overvalue or ignore good information?
First, I'd like to highlight that policymakers may not be special here. Researchers might also sometimes, undervalue or overvalue new evidence. And in fact, some of my work suggests they're prone to the same behavioral biases. We're all human and we all have behavioral biases that could lead to this undervaluing or overvaluing of evidence. For example, there's a lot of literature that suggests that people are subject to confirmation bias, where they are more likely to put weight on results that agree with their pre-existing beliefs and disregard evidence that goes against those beliefs. That's just one example of the types of biases people may have.
When we have these biases coming into play, as you say, it happens all the time and it happens to everybody. When policymakers are subject to these biases, does this mean that we've got missed opportunities? We could do a little bit better than we're doing already? Or is the risk bigger than that?
It could be even worse than that. Suppose you have some program where there's been a range of estimated treatment effects. Suppose people are more apt to believe good news than bad news. Now you see this huge range of results and you say, oh, well, it must be the good news. The positive results must be correct. You might choose a program even if it typically, on average, even has negative results, right? Negative impacts. You might still choose that program. That would be a pretty extreme case, but I do think it's really important, given the magnitude of the decisions that policymakers make, that they make that decision in the best way possible.
So, Eva, in your recent papers, you describe an experiment that was done with large groups of policymakers and practitioners and researchers as well. So where do you find a group like this all in one place?
Largely at workshops. For example, with my co-author, Aidan Koval, we have run them at World Bank workshops, at Inter-American Development Bank workshops. They're a great setting to get people all in one place, as you say. And because these workshops focus on impact evaluation, that's where you can find people who really do care about evidence, because not everybody does. So this is the best case scenario. Even amongst people who really care about it, do they get it right?
Right. And at the beginning, I guess you have to have some sort of baseline. You have to test their beliefs that they come into this situation with. How do you test what those are and how they differ?
We like to elicit full distributions of beliefs. So what we'll do is we'll describe a particular program or intervention and then ask them what they think the effect is going to be and ask them to place weight in bins. So suppose you have a cash transfer program and it's supposed to affect enrollment rates in school for children. How likely do you think it is that this particular program would have improved enrollment rates between 0 and 1 percentage point, 1 and 2 percentage points? You ask them to place weight in bins that way, and that way you can get a whole distribution of their prior beliefs.
And your research is really about how they update those beliefs in the face of evidence. Again, how do you measure how much they are prepared to update their beliefs and how they update their beliefs in the face of new evidence?
After we ask them to place weight in bins to represent the distribution of their prior beliefs, we show them some new evidence, and then we ask them to place weight in bins again to represent their posterior beliefs. And if you compare the prior beliefs and the posterior beliefs, you see how much they've shifted their opinion based off of the evidence that you provided.
Now, you're also interested in their biases, aren't you? And as you pointed out, there are many, many potential biases that could enter into this. Which ones were you interested in?
Yeah, so we were interested in a couple of them. First, we looked at asymmetric optimism. This is a good news, bad news effect where you update your beliefs more if you're exposed to information that's more positive than your priors. So for example, suppose I asked you, what do you think is the effect of this cash transfer program on enrollment rates? And you say, I think it's going to improve enrollment rates by 3 percentage points. And now we either show you evidence that says it's 5 or it's 1. And if we show you evidence that shows it's 5, you're like, oh, great, it's 5. But if we show you evidence that says it's 1, you're like, maybe it's 2. So you're a little bit more reluctant to go there. Another bias we focused on was something that we call variance neglect, which is a novel bias somewhat similar to small sample size neglect or extension neglect. So with sample size neglect, you trust results from studies with really tiny samples as much as you trust results from studies with really large samples, which of course are better estimated. And similarly with variance neglect, you're relatively insensitive to confidence intervals or information about uncertainty. So you might update too much on results that were really noisily estimated, where you can't really say that much, and too little on results that were really precisely estimated.
I can see how both of those are directly relevant to that evidence to policy pipeline. So what did you discover about those biases? How much of an optimism bias and how much is there a neglect of those confidence intervals amongst policymakers?
They are affected by both of these biases in a meaningful way, and these biases also affect how they make decisions over how to allocate resources. And actually, we found that all of the different subgroups, policymakers, practitioners, and researchers, seem to suffer from them. At least I can't reject that the different subgroups are subject to them to the same extent. So this means that any observed differences in prior beliefs must be due to some other factor. So either some other bias or perhaps more likely that they were previously exposed to different sets of information.
Yeah, so, we put all this together, all the research that you've done here, and what can we say about the way that policymakers are responding to having new evidence that could update their beliefs?
Yeah, so they do update their beliefs in response to new evidence, and they do change their behaviors as a result, but just not in the same way as they would if they were not subject to these biases. So for example, you might have a situation where you've got some kind of estimate from a study. Maybe it was a small pilot study. You didn't have that many observations. It was very noisily estimated, and you put a lot of trust in that. Now you've decided to scale up your intervention, and actually turns out it has very different impacts because you over-trusted the results from the small pilot.
And definitely something that we have seen and has happened in the past. You also wanted to find out about how policymakers value local knowledge against formal evidence. Why might local knowledge be a valuable thing, a good thing for them to reference?
Context is very important. I have a paper in the Journal of the European Economics Association, which finds that results from different studies of the same intervention looking at the same outcome can still find wildly different effects. So just for a rule of thumb, if past studies find that a particular intervention improves some outcome by X on average, it's still about as likely that the next result will be outside of the range 0 to 2x as it is to be between 0 to 2x. Then you start to wonder, well, why do results vary so much? And one of the leading candidate explanations is contextual differences. And local knowledge hopefully can tell you more about those contextual differences and lead you to better guess what the effect might be in your own setting.
Yeah, we've covered several studies in which this has proved to be extremely valuable. So I suppose I should ask the other question. Why might local knowledge be a bad thing?
It's not enough to have done something in your area. And actually, a lot of people will think, hey, all I need is a study done in my country. But results can even vary quite a bit within a country. And based on some exploratory analyses, I don't think it's right to say that looking within a country solves the problem. Quite a lot of variance remains even then. And also, if you're looking for local evidence, you might overlook valid contributions from outside your area. It's not the case that studies done elsewhere are completely uninformative. They may still have something to say about your situation, and maybe more than you would think.
So, again, from your study, what did you find out about the weight that policymakers put on that local evidence, that local knowledge?
Yeah, they greatly value it. We found that policymakers were willing to accept a program that had a much smaller estimated effect if it were recommended by a local expert or if there had been some impact evaluation done in their country on that. The magnitudes are very large here. So we were looking at cash transfer programs where even if you have a study that has very large impacts, but it was done somewhere else, you would prefer the program that has smaller impacts so long as it was done in your own setting. There's really quite a lot of weight placed on these things.
And in this context, if you wanted to present formal evidence to that policymaker and you thought that was valuable, what sort of formal evidence do they give most weight to? Can we tease that out?
The good news is that if you do have evidence from that setting, they are more likely to pay attention to it by far. And they also will pay a lot of attention to the estimated impact. So I think this really pushes us to think of doing more studies locally, wherever that policymaker happens to be, to do the thing that is tailored precisely to them as much as possible.
Yes, it certainly does. And there are a lot of practical lessons from your research here that I can see that we could apply. So let's talk about those in a second. So first of all, Eva, does your research imply that researchers, when they are presenting their evidence, should be giving more attention to how exactly they present that evidence rather than assuming that data speaks for itself?
Absolutely. There's a lot of value in presenting evidence better.
So, how should they do this? First of all, their statistics. To get the most attention, how do they present the data that they know?
My research would suggest that when you've got bad news, you should bring more evidence in support of that because some of that information is going to be disregarded. I also found some suggestive evidence in a follow-up experiment, although this was not with policymakers, that people may be better at interpreting information from sample sizes than from confidence intervals. So this suggests that when researchers present the results or analysts put together summaries of the existing evidence, they should not only tell you about whether something is significant or give you the confidence interval, but also make sure to provide information about the sample size.
You have already pointed out the importance of context and the weight that's given there. It's not always possible to have done the research in a place that is local to where the policymaker wants to make that policy. I guess this goes back to how you plan your research agenda if you do want to influence decision-making.
Absolutely. I think there can be a lot more coordination between researchers and policymakers before the study even gets off the ground. And that could definitely lead to better take-up of the results and better design of the experiment to speak to the concerns that the policymaker has.
This is something that I very rarely discuss, these sorts of potential problems. Does the fact that these issues exist, and perhaps they're not always acknowledged, does this undermine the gains that we have made with the credibility revolution? The fact that we do have more rigorous evidence, but perhaps it's not always put into practice for reasons that we don't expect.
Obviously, I think the credibility revolution is a very good thing. What I would say is that given that there can be barriers to that evidence being taken up, the work doesn't end just at finishing a study. And you'd accomplish a lot more if you took the time to try to translate your research findings into a form that might lead to its being taken up. This kind of work is more like a multiplier effect of the effect of your study. And, hopefully we all want to do impactful research. So I think there's a lot more that could be done here, both at the initial design phase and now that you've got the results in trying to communicate them appropriately.
I'm sure policymakers are listening, and I'm sure researchers are listening as well. So let's hope this leads to a more fruitful dialogue. Thank you very much, Eva.
Thank you so much.
If you want to consult the two papers we've been referring to, the first one, Vivalt et al. From 2024, Local Knowledge, Formal Evidence and Policy Decisions, and also Vivalt and Coville from 2023. How do policymakers update their beliefs? And that was in the journal Development Economics 165. This has been a VoxDevTalk. The best way to make sure you don't miss an episode is to subscribe. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. Our past episodes, as always, are at voxdev.org.